In this class, we will be looking at the key conceptual and theoretical debates in human rights studies. One central question is whether human rights are indeed universal or whether they're culturally relative to different societies and cultures. This tension between the universalism of human rights and arguments for cultural relativism is central to the core philosophical debates relating to human rights. Modern human rights are premised on the assumption of universality. The United Nations Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which is the foundational document of the international human rights system, asserts the universality of human rights. As part of the process of drafting the Universal Declaration of Human Rights in 1948, the United Nations set up a committee of statesmen, historians, lawyers, philosophers, and religious leaders to find out if there can be agreement among the cultures of the world on a certain fundamental human rights regime. This was part of an effort to justify these rights as universal and inalienable. Despite this effort at asserting their common human values, universal human rights continue to be challenged by claims of political, social, and cultural relativism. At the core of the cultural relativism debate is a conflict between collectivist thinkers who place the community above the individual and individualists who place the individual above the community. Proponents of cultural relativity of human rights argue that human rights as conceived in the West are not necessarily applicable to third world or non-Western societies because of their philosophical basis that is not only different, but indeed opposite. These scholars argue that whereas Western traditions of rights are based on the notion of the autonomous individual, many non-Western conceptions do not emphasize such insular individualism. Rather, non-Western conceptions emphasize collective rights and communal solidarity. It is also said that non-Western conceptions also emphasize the relationship between rights and duties. To be sure, these are arguments advanced to challenge the notion of universal human rights. Proponents of the cultural relativism of human rights argue that the current formulation of universal human rights contains three basic elements that reflect Western values and make them ill-suited to some non-Western societies. Firstly, they argue that a fundamental unit of the society is conceived as the individual, not the family or community. Secondly, they argue that the primary basis for securing human existence in society is through rights, not duties. And thirdly, they argue that the primary method of securing rights is through adversary legalism, where rights are claimed and adjudicated upon, not through reconciliation or consensus building. Arguments for cultural relativism in human rights debates have been categorized into strong cultural relativism and weak cultural relativism. Strong cultural relativism holds that culture is the principal source of the validity of a moral code or rule. The presumption is that rights and other practices, values, and norms are culturally determined, but that the universality of human nature and rights serves as a check on the potential excesses of relativism. Weak cultural relativism, on the other hand, holds that human rights are essentially universal, but recognizes culture as an important source of exceptions in the interpretation of human rights. Opponents of the arguments for cultural relativism feared that these arguments can undermine universal human rights. If human rights are culturally relative, then there can be no universal human rights standards. Each society or country would have the prerogative to set its own relative human rights standards. That in itself would contradict the very essence of international human rights as inalienable entitlements that all humans have, irrespective of their cultural orientations. The debate on the universality or cultural relativity of human rights has centered on the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and other related international conventions. Perhaps the most famous argument for cultural relativism as it applies to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights is the often quoted reaction of the American Anthropological Association to the Universal Declaration when it was proposed by the United Nations in 1947. The American Anthropological Association argued at the time, and I'm quoting here, standards and values are relative to the culture from which they derive, such that what is held to be a human right in one society may be regarded as antisocial by another people. The Bangkok Declaration on Human Rights makes a similar argument. The Bangkok Declaration was presented by several non-Western countries, including Cuba, China, Indonesia, and Iran, at the 1993 United Nations Human Rights Conference in Vienna. Although the Bangkok Declaration affirmed universal human rights and the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, it also in some ways called its universal premise into question. It states that some rights outlined in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights have no roots or sanctions in the traditions of most countries of the world. It also argued that if these rights were to be taken seriously, they must be expanded to include the idea of economic development as a basic human right, and as such, an essential part of any acceptable conception of human rights. The challenge to universal human rights is best reflected in the arguments for Asian values and African values in the conception and interpretation of human rights. The central themes in the Asian values and the African values debate center on the philosophical foundations of non-Western concepts of human rights and how these concepts differ from Western notions and institutions which were subsequently extended to other parts of the world through Western political and cultural imperialism. Proponents of African values in the interpretation of human rights, for example, argue the validity of a uniquely African concept of human rights. They challenge the Western-oriented, state-centered, and individual-focused thinking that dominates the human rights movement. The argument for an African concept of human rights is rooted in the belief in the distinctively different philosophical bases and worldviews of Western societies and African societies. This worldview is founded not primarily on the individual, but on the community, to which the individual related on the basis of obligations and duties. Rights in this context included, but were not limited to, the right to political representation, which was often guaranteed by the family, the clan, and the community. The society developed certain central social features that tended to foster the promotion of individual and collective rights. Proponents of the African values debate in the interpretation of human rights argue that traditional African conceptions of human rights emphasize the group, sameness, and commonality, as well as a sense of cooperation, interdependence, and collective responsibility. In these circumstances, the concept of human rights did not stand in isolation. It went with duties. Although certain rights attached to individuals by virtue of birth and membership of the community they were also obligated to go along with corresponding communal duties and obligations. This communal philosophy has been made the cornerstone of the main regional human rights document in Africa, called the African Charter of Human and People's Rights, which emphasizes the collective rights of peoples as well as the relationships between rights and duties. The arguments for Asian values in the human rights debate are similar to those that have been advanced for African values. Some leaders of East and Southeast Asian countries stress Asia's incommensurable differences from the West and demand a different treatment of their human rights record by the international community. They reject the globalization of human rights, and they claim that Asia has a unique set of values which provide the basis for Asia's different understanding of human rights. And they justify the handling of rights by Asian governments on the basis of these different values. Proponents of Asian values also argue that the circumstances that prompted the institutionalization of human rights in the West do not exist in Asian countries. Besides, the importance of the community in Asian culture is said to be incompatible with the primacy of the individual upon which the Western notion of human rights rests. The relationship between individuals and communities constitutes the key difference between Asian and Western cultural values, they argue. You do not have to agree with these culturally relativist positions, but I think it's important to understand them. It is important to understand the cultural foundations of the critique of universal human rights. These arguments for peculiarly communal African values or Asian values in the conception of human rights have been criticized by those who believe in universal human rights. Critics have suggested that in asserting these relativist human rights values, they can also provide an excuse for violating established universal human rights. For example, in some countries, women are denied equal rights on the grounds of religion and cultural traditions. In these contexts, the culturally relativist argument can become a basis of denying minority groups and non-dominant populations of their own fundamental human rights. Similarly, in some cultures, discrimination on the basis of gender, caste, ethnicity, race, religion, and sexual orientation is permitted in the name of culture. If such discriminations can be justified in the name of culture, then many people around the world will be denied of their basic human rights. So, how then do we balance the tension between universal human rights ideals and the arguments for cultural relativism? While there may be a core set of universal values that reflect inherent human worth in various societies, it is clear that the broad expression of these values may vary, not only in accordance with historical circumstances, but also based on peculiar social and political contexts. Most scholars agree on the point that in order to find cross-cultural legitimacy, universal rights necessarily have to be tempered by the specific cultural experiences of various societies. The challenge, however, is how to strike the delicate balance between maintaining a core set of basic universal human rights and yet allowing for some form of cultural expression and diversity. This is the central challenge of universal human rights. The debate over the cultural relativism of human rights also extends to questions of categorizing and prioritizing rights. A number of attempts have been made to establish a hierarchy of human rights, or a list of basic human rights, which cannot be violated under any circumstances, as opposed to human rights that are of secondary importance. The central question here is whether all human rights are of equal importance or whether some rights take precedence over others. This is sometimes presented in terms of the generation of rights. Civil and political rights are considered first-generation rights. Economic, social, and cultural rights are considered second-generation rights. And then solidarity rights and collective rights, right to development, all these rights are considered third-generation rights. Later in this course, we will examine using specific case studies how different societies have attempted to prioritize human rights and balance universal human rights with the local political, social, and cultural values in these societies.